all Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. And as their president, I will fight to keep them safe. I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters. But in recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. A number of state and local governments have failed to take necessary action to safeguard their residents. Innocent people have been savagely beaten, like the young man in Dallas, Texas, who was left dying on the street, or the woman in upstate New York viciously attacked by dangerous thugs. Small business owners have seen their dreams utterly destroyed. New York's finest have been hit in the face with bricks. Brave nurses who have battled the virus are afraid to leave their homes. A police precinct has been overrun. Here in the nation's capital, the Lincoln Memorial and the World War II Memorial have been vandalized. One of our most historic churches was set ablaze. A federal officer in California, an African-American enforcement hero, was shot and killed. These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror. The destruction of innocent life and the spilling of innocent blood is an offense to humanity and a crime against God. America needs creation, not destruction. Cooperation, not contempt. Security, not anarchy. Healing, not hatred. Justice, not chaos. This is our mission, and we will succeed. 100%, we will succeed. Our country always wins. That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. I am also taking swift and decisive action to protect our great capital, Washington, D.C. What happened in this city last night was a total disgrace. As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property. We are putting everybody on warning. Our 7 o'clock curfew will be strictly enforced. Those who threaten innocent life and property will be arrested, detained, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I want the organizers of this terror to be on notice that you will face severe criminal penalties and lengthy sentences in jail. This includes Antifa and others who are leading instigators of this violence. One law and order, and that is what it is. One law. We have one beautiful law. And once that is restored and fully restored, we will help you, we will help your business, and we will help your family. America is founded upon the rule of law. It is the foundation of our prosperity, our freedom, and our very way of life. But where there is no law, there is no opportunity. Where there is no justice, there is no liberty. Where there is no safety, there is no future. We must never give in to anger or hatred. If malice or violence reigns, then none of us is free. I take these actions today with firm resolve and with a true and passionate love for our country. By far, our greatest days lie ahead. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to pay my respects to a very, very special place. Thank you very much.
All right, you've just been listening. You've just been listening to President Donald Trump there speaking from the Rose Garden. He came out for the very first time since we've seen the unrest, since the death of George Floyd, to talk to the American people and said his job, his immediate job, was to call for safety and protect people and businesses nationwide. Tom Fitzgerald is live near the scene there. Tom, I want to ask you, I know while he was talking, we started seeing some of those protesters back up. Here we are just 9 minutes away from the start of this curfew. What was your takeaway?
Well, it was interesting, Sean, because when you were playing that earlier in the newscast tonight, we were down at Lafayette Park, and we did see Uniformed Secret Service moving closer, almost as we drew closer to the president's remarks. So the message here, though, that we heard from a lot of these protesters, though, was that they were really interested in what the president had to say tonight. A lot of them had already made up their minds about the president and his policies. So largely, we may have crossed a bridge here as to whether any presidential remarks could make a difference in this.
Fitz, I know a lot of people have been very critical. They said he should have come out sooner. People have even accused him of stoking the fire. We saw some of the tweets that he sent out there. Do you think that his message today will make a difference?
That'll be, time will tell, Sean. You know, what is clear is there was an internal debate amongst the White House staff last night about what the next steps should be. Whether or not the president should even come out and do this tonight was a subject of great debate amongst the White House staff. And the New York Times reported last night that the president himself had no appetite for making any kind of address like the one he just made. So whether or not this makes any difference, it's hard to see that, because there was no way that the people that were down on 16th and H tonight had any means besides their phones, if they cared to listen to it, to listen to what the president had to say tonight. So in large part, they are going with their own already formed opinions of both this president and his presidency and this march that is underway now for the last 3 days.
Fitz, one of the first things the president came out and said is that he wanted to express his thoughts and prayers with the family of George Floyd, and said immediately we will be seeking justice for them. And as we watch, you can't see the images right now live going on here at Lafayette Park. Protesters are still there. They do appear to be backing up. I just wonder, you know, you've been down there today. You've been in the crowd. You've felt the mood of the crowd here in D.C. Maybe the message won't be heard here. Do you think the president's message will be heard at other cities across the nation? He said he spoke to governors today and said, look, if you don't get this under control, then I will.
Sean, I can tell you I have had discussions with sources in governor's office that said that phone call today was described by some as emotional, and one said and used the word unhinged. The president repeatedly telling the governors they had to get tougher and they had to show force. That apparently did not go over well with a lot of the governors who have been dealing with this in their own states. So,
what's that?
Again, when you ask these folks, what do you want to hear from the president? They don't want to hear anything from the president. They believe that they've heard 3 years of this administration and this presidency to bring them to this point where they've made these decisions about these actions that they're taking right now. So whether or not the president makes these remarks tonight and it does take a step in the right direction and calming some of this adversity, it's hard to see. One thing I will say, though, Sean, is that the president has repeatedly, talked about George Floyd and the fact that, he did not think that what happened to George Floyd was right. However, when these remarks came out about looting, when these other remarks came out that he's been, tweeting over the last couple of days, the Houston police chief today said very bluntly, and I won't repeat the remark, that if you do not have something constructive to add to this conversation, stop adding to the conversation.
Fitz, let me ask you, I know that, through your reporting and through the different contacts that you've had, you've also been in contact with U.S. senators, members of the House, local members, politicians. Any reaction or from them about the president, some of his initial responses on Twitter, and then the calls? Let me just go back to our live video right now here in Lafayette Park. You can see police, mounted police right now. They are now lined up behind the police that are there with the shields. Again, the D.C. curfew is set to go in effect here in about 4 minutes. And as you can see right now, there are still a number of protesters who are still being peaceful right there along that police line. But the mayor has called for the curfew tonight at 7 o'clock. It looks like D.C. police are prepared to move forward to keep those people from going anywhere. We're going to stay on top of that. Fitz, back to our question real quick. Any reaction or any response to local lawmakers about what has been going on so far?
Yeah, Sean, just a slight correction to what we're seeing there on the screen there. That is not Lafayette Park. You're looking at 6th Street and 8th Street. You can see the A. Adams Hotel right at the top of the screen behind those flowers. Lafayette Park is closed right now. It is behind barricades, and there are double lines of police with riot shields in place right now. So no one except law enforcement is in Lafayette Park right now. As to this reaction, we talked to Senator Tim Kaine the other day. Clearly, the Democrats have been very forceful about talking about the things and the way that the president is talking about all this. You haven't heard as much from Republicans, and that's telling, because in past instances, whether it would be the Russia investigation, whether it would be things like the Supreme Court nomination, the GOP was very full-throated in their support of the president and his policies and as he was defending himself, Sean. We've not heard as much of that throughout this situation from the Republicans.
I believe Blake and Marina are joining us right now. Blake, did you have something you wanted to talk to Fitz about?
Yeah, well, this is Blake McCoy. Marina Morocco is also joining us, and she was here over the weekend when those protests turned violent in front of the White House. We are now approaching the 7 o'clock hour. We are just 2 minutes away from a curfew taking effect in the District of Columbia. Remember last time the curfew didn't take effect till 11 p.m.? Some criticized the mayor's decision for having that curfew take effect so late, especially after darkness had already fallen. Now they are clearly taking a different approach tonight, and you can see the crowd gathered in front of the White House right now being met face to face with police officers. If you missed President Trump's remarks, they were very brief, about 6:45. He did say he is your law and order president, and he will be mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military. And he said if governors do not activate their National Guard and do not take a hard stance on these protesters, that he will send in the U.S. military and take control and bring peace. The president says he will end the riots now and, quote, will dominate the streets with overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence is quelled. Marina?
Yeah, and Blake, I think when we asked the mayor earlier today, I know Tom Fitzgerald was down there at that press conference that happened about 1 o'clock this afternoon, if she felt that she had maybe lost an opportunity to quell the violence yesterday by making the curfew at 11 p.m. Again, today, this curfew about to start here in the next 50 seconds, and it looks like this crowd is going nowhere. She put it 4 hours into effect earlier today. And to some degree, that's a concession by the mayor that things did get out of hand, that her police out of pocket because the crowd's simply too violent to bring in police, to bring in fire crews to attempt to put out the flames that were surrounding the White House and Lafayette Square. And again, you're looking about a block north from the White House. To the left there was the building that was looted last night and that was lit on fire. That is the AFL-CIO building. Behind the military police, those are National Guardsmen there with those shields on the back police line. That front police line there, I believe it looks as though that is DC police in riot gear. So again, you see multiple jurisdictions in the area, both local and federal, as this shot freezes. But tonight you see it is now officially 7 p.m. We are into this curfew. The crowd is going nowhere. And in the next minutes here, I would expect to see the police presence start to move towards the crowd. Tom?
Let's bring in Jim Lokay here. Jim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, let me just, I want to add on to what Blake said first of all. So you mentioned about the president possibly trying to deploy the military on civilian soil. There's something called the Insurrection Act. This is something that I can't off the top of my head tell you the last time that was activated in this country, but that is what has to be invoked by the president of the United States to activate the military on U.S. soil. Fitz, we should point out before we go back to you, a lot of speculation as to where President Trump is going to go because you heard him mention going to a special place. We saw all that activity in Lafayette Park. There are some people that believe maybe he's going over to St. John's Episcopal Church, which was a flashpoint last night where you had fire breaking out in the basement, although the structure of the church itself has been safe. Go for it, Fitz.
Well, what I would say, if that does happen, that would be surprising because that shot that we just had,
right,
where you see the Hay Adams Hotel behind you, St. John Church is right across the street from the Hay Adams Hotel. So all of those people that are still on the street right now, they would have been within the line of sight of the President of the United States in probably one of the most heated civil rights protests we've seen since the 1960s. To insert the President of the United States into that powder keg would be surprising.
Why do you
say the least?
Why do you think Attorney General Bill Barr went out and because he was out there within the last hour surveying the crowd, surveying the troops, surveying the National Guardsmen who had lined up out there? I mean, that of course that itself too was a big security undertaking. And by the way, Fitz, before I go back to you, just a reminder: the curfew is now in effect in D.C. The 7 o'clock curfew is now in effect, and as you look at the left side of your screen, you're not seeing much activity. Not many people moving around at this point.
Yeah. Well, on William Barr, I would suggest that he is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. And under his purview are all of the apparatus involved in the federal response to this. So for Barr to go out there and to survey what was going on out there, that does seem to be a proper disposition of his responsibilities in all of this.
Okay.
Were the President of the United States to do that, Jim, that would be remarkable.
Hey, Fitz, this is Sean. I mean, so do you think a lot of this is optics? We know the Attorney General directed the Bureau of Prisons to send riot teams to D.C. and also to Miami to head off what they're calling violent protests and the riots that have broken out in those cities. Is this, all right, hold on, we've got a different visual here.
It looks like we're looking at the press corps there running outside the White House gates into Lafayette Park. It's unclear why they're being removed from the White House grounds, but you see them there leaving the White House gates. And again, this area is secure. This is exactly 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's on the side of the West Wing. What we're looking at, that gate, as you see, we're looking here to see who's about to come out.
There he is. There's the president right now.
Is making his way outside the White House gate, and you see Attorney General Bill Barr also walking, the president walking alongside his daughter, Ivanka Trump, as well as his advisor, Jared Kushner, and it appears they are now exiting the White House grounds.
So
maybe this is the special place that we were talking about.
Let's see if we can
There's
listen
the President of the United States right there.
this is an extraordinary moment right now we're watching unfold here. We're going to try to listen to see if we hear anything as the president is being led out of the White House. There it is. Across crossing Pennsylvania Avenue,
Press, we're moving. Come on.
heading over towards Lafayette Park, presumably. And again, as we mentioned, the president had said he was going to a special place.
You can see Attorney General Bill Barr behind him,
Is he going this way?
Ivanka Trump.
Which way is he?
Really remarkable amount of security. Keep in mind, normally when the president makes an appearance anywhere, the crowds around him have gone through extensive security screenings, metal detectors. That's not the case with the crowd of protesters in front of the White House. There's still a good bit of distance, it looks like, between them and the president.
And just quickly, as we watch these images unfold, we should remind our viewers that twice in the last 4 days here, the president has been whisked away by the Secret Service to an underground bunker at the White House. And the optics of that, you can imagine what that represents. And now seeing a stark contrast to that as the president effectively walks out the White House into Lafayette Square, which has been the epicenter of much of the tension here in Washington, D.C. throughout these last 4 days. You see him walking by himself, his advisors well behind him, of course, Secret Service behind him as well. But he looks to be walking now up towards H Street, and we've pointed out to this intersection, which is where we saw that brush fire last night. That is where St. John's Episcopal Church is. It is where the Hay Adams Hotel is. And the White House press corps, they are just as amazed at this scene unfolding as we are.
And we should point out, within the last...
when we talk about this, Marina, you mentioned or Jim, you mentioned this was unprecedented. This is not something that we typically see the president leave the White House. The press corps doesn't appear to know exactly where he's going. They're yelling questions as you see him walk, and you see the Secret Service continue to push the press corps back. But this is an amazing moment right now. No one knows exactly where the president is going, but still just amazing to see him and all of his advisors walking along the streets of D.C. like this. But you can take note, there are no protesters around this area where we see the president walking tonight.
Sean, what we saw within the last half hour out there, the action, the sudden movement of the guards, of the police, of law enforcement outside of the White House. You saw the tear gas being fired. You saw other objects being fired out there. We're not seeing unrest like we saw last night outside of that until that moment. And clearly what we're seeing now is clearing a path for, as you see the cameras continue to move through Lafayette Park with the president and his many advisors and guards nearby, getting a sense that maybe he is heading over towards St. John's Episcopal Church.
Yeah, and Jim, for folks who are just joining us now, St. John's Episcopal Church has been erected in D.C. since the early 1800s. It is a church that has been visited by every White House administration, including the president. And in the past, every time I'm learning that he has visited St. John's, he has visited in the Beast, which is his armored vehicle flanked by security. He has never walked from the White House to that church. And given the turmoil, the protests, the violent disturbances that we've seen in the past few days, it's truly remarkable that he is walking there, because every single president in history has driven to that church, which is about a half a block away from the White House.
Right there. To the corner. Right behind you, sir.
Remarkable to see him pictured in front of that graffiti from the protest that happened over the weekend. Look at that.
Mr. President, your thoughts right now?
And there is St. John's Episcopal Church, as you all know. It was damaged by fire. Firefighters put out flames that were in the basement yesterday of this historic church. Also, a fire burned outside of the church at one point yesterday.
This is clearly a moment for symbolism. It doesn't appear that we're going to see the president meet with anybody at this point, at least from this perspective, from St. John's.
I wonder, when we saw the Attorney General walking out earlier, if he was assessing the security.
May very well be.
Before the president made his walk across the square there.
And yesterday, about the 10 o'clock hours, when we saw the first images of flames erupting from the basement there of St. John's, presumably started at the hands of violent agitators, if you will, because protesters were peaceably assembling, and you see the president there standing on the steps of St. John's.
All right, so it looks like the president, he's holding a Bible, it appears. All right, let's listen in.
Greatest country in the world. Make it even great. We will make it even greater. It won't take long. It's not going to take long to see what's going on. It's coming back. It's coming back strong. It'll be greater than ever before.
So you just heard the president say the country's coming back stronger. More or less the same statement he delivered over in the Rose Garden a few moments ago. Josh Rosenthal, let's check in with Josh right now. I know Josh was out there last night. Josh, where are you and what are you seeing?
So, Jim, I am on I Street. We're just a few blocks from the White House. My crew actually just made it down here to downtown D.C., and I want to set the scene for you and explain what we're seeing here. Essentially, St. John's Church, where you just saw that historic moment with the president, is only a few blocks away, and we're walking in that direction. Most of the people that you see here now were protesting near Lafayette shortly before the president made his appearance. Now, as I said, we're just getting down here right now. However, I was monitoring the scene both on Twitter, and since I've been here, I've talked to protesters. They claim that they were peaceful, that there were no skirmishes, there was no problem whatsoever.
Right.
And then around 6:30, pepper spray started coming out. Police officers started firing rubber bullets.
Josh, let me interrupt. Josh, let me just interrupt you for people watching this, and you're seeing the assembly outside of the church. Clearly, what this is at this moment is you're seeing this photo op play out where you have from left to right. That's Mark Esper, the defense secretary. Let's listen in. That is it.
But to keep it nice and safe.
Go far. I do not know who the gentleman in the gray suit is. We saw Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary. So that was just what happened there. It was an semblance, a quick word. But Josh, go back to it. I just wanted to give people a little bit of insight what happened there.
Sure, Jim. What you're saying,
no
because
worries.
There's so much going on. Closer to Lafayette Square in St. John's Church, where we saw the president. What's happening now is they're kind of at a standstill. You can see a couple of gentlemen here looking at this line of military police. We just heard the president talk about how there would be a larger police presence down here tonight, and military police specifically, and certainly just from what we're looking at right now, we're seeing that. I can tell you, just arriving here, it does not appear as though the situation is as after 7, DC's curfew just kicked in, and there's still a whole lot of night in front of us. Jim Marina.
I have to say this is a little odd what we've seen, because normally if a president would come out and do this and either go and talk to protesters or go in front of a church, he would maybe offer flowers or say a prayer if he was going to the church. We didn't see any of that. He just held up the Bible, said we are a great country, and went back inside. So I don't know exactly what the point of this visit was, other than, of course, the symbolism of him leaving the White House.
Right.
Certainly an unprecedented moment.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point. It was a photo opportunity. I mean, that's what it was. He walked from the White House in a show that we don't typically see.
Right.
They walked across Lafayette Park to stand in front of this historic church with some of his cabinet members. It was a photo op.
Are you surprised he didn't have any prepared remarks, Sean, when he got there? It didn't seem like he quite knew what he was doing in front of the church.
I was expecting the president to maybe have something else to say, and I think the press corps was expecting that as well. It was almost like, you know, they didn't get the heads up. We saw them running when everyone started leaving the White House. They didn't know what to expect. They asked questions. He didn't answer any questions, and I think the members of the press that are down there were a little surprised to hear that he didn't say anything once they got there. They just sort of posed for the picture. Someone asked him if he was holding his Bible. He said, "This is a Bible," and you heard him say, America's a great country.
This, of course, comes after those reports today that the president was taken to the bunker over the weekend as protests grew violent in front of the White House. We know the president is very active on social media. I'm sure he's seen all of those reports today and wasn't happy with what he was reading. And this clearly is an effort to counter that narrative that the president is not hiding from anything.
Tom Fitzgerald standing by. Fitz, let's go back to you. So we did see that journey from the White House across the street. He is heading back right now. Unprecedented, you could certainly call it that.
Well, I think when we were discussing the possibility of it before, Jim, I used the word remarkable, and that was remarkable, no matter what you make of exactly what it was. Remember, there is some historical precedent for this. Richard Nixon went in the dark of night during the height of the Vietnam protests, met with protesters, but ultimately that did not heal any divide between the anti-Nixon forces and the Nixon administration. It's hard to see that this gesture tonight would bridge any gap that has existed. In fact, the president said today he was taking immediate action. Let's remember, we are 6 days into that. In the view of many, the time for immediate action may have passed. But nonetheless, this is a historical marker we just saw just now. But as George W. Bush was wont to say at times, history writes itself, and we will see later on from now whether or not it's had any impact on what's gone on, not only in the nation's capital, but in Minneapolis, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in Washington State. This is a nationwide situation going on right now, and this administration at this point does not seem to have quelled this.
So as you saw St. John's Church again last night in the midst of the protests, which certainly did turn violent and turn destructive, there was a small fire set in the church. The structure of the church remains intact. It was set in the basement of the parish hall.
Mr. President, are you prepared?
Let's listen in here.
Let's go.
Thank you very much.
President thanking the members of the National Guard out there. So you all know what happened within the last hour. We saw a lot of action outside of the White House shortly before he was set to speak at 6:30. There were protesters outside, certainly not to the level of what we saw last night, but still very boisterous, people getting their point across. And then tear gas was deployed. Other tactics were deployed to push some of those protesters back, clearly to clear space for the president to make that walk, which started within the last 15, 20 minutes. We keep hearing audio coming in and out here.
Yeah, let's see if we can hear anything. The president, of course, is not much.
Wing of the White House. Two things that really stood out to me is that just minutes before the president made his trek across to St. John's, we were taking that picture, essentially this picture here, just up the Hay Adams from the St. John's, and you saw two police lines that were very far back from Lafayette Square, which meant that, yes, the curfew was in effect, but it seemed as though it was an extra protected reinforcement barrier that we've not seen throughout these protests. Even in the most violent times, we've only seen one police line. To have two that was compiled of, you see there, National Guard, Park Police, as well as other jurisdictions in the area was significant. And I don't know, Jim, if you saw this, but as the president was walking back into the White House, not only did we see his daughter Ivanka Trump, but you see her there in the hoodie. That is Hope Hicks, who for a long time led the president's communications team and has been very much in charge of the behind-the-scenes optics. And it seems as though after his address at the Rose Garden at about 6:45, someone had a talk with the president and suggested, and maybe he did, that he do this trek on foot over to St. John's. And when they walked back, we saw the press again head in front of the president over towards this area, which is known as Pebble Beach on the White House along the West Wing there.
Right.
And stand by as the president walked, flanked by both those lines of uniformed Secret Service as well as Park Police. Again, a lot of imagery there.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Josh Rosenthal, let's go back to you right now as we take a look There are still people assembled out there, Josh. What's going on?
Yeah, so Jim, I'm still at 16th and I, and tensions are rising by the minute. What's happening here is you have DC police who just arrived on bicycles, and they're pushing this crowd of protesters back. Many of the protesters have no interest in coming. We were actually just about to talk to a protester named Shayna, who'd been standing there with a sign. She said she wasn't going to go anywhere, and actually now I'm looking at her in this crowd telling police that she has a right to be there. You can see what's happening here. This is a clash, and I think it's extremely important to remember that all of this chaos is happening a mere 2 blocks from the White House, where we also see a line of military police. Behind them, you have police on horseback, and we, just like everyone else, continue to get pushed back by DC police. We're, of course, doing everything that they're telling us to do, trying to stay safe while reporting this, and also trying to follow orders. But it's a very unpredictable situation, guys, and one that I can tell you these protesters didn't expect, and frankly, neither did we. We have seen these escalations down here on previous nights, but we have not seen them this early, and you have to think that one of the reasons why this is happening right now may be because the DC curfew just kicked in 20 minutes ago at 7. And you can see what's resulting. You've got people trying to stay where they were, but police not wanting to let them do so. And at the moment, it appears as though we have a bit of a tense standoff, with protesters refusing to move and police ordering them to do so. There are helicopters flying overhead, something that you don't typically see here in downtown D.C.
No,
typically, this is restricted airspace. You don't see much of that. And for right now, the standstill appears to be taking place here on I Street, just by the intersection at 16th. And again, I can't mention this enough, we are 2 blocks away from the White House. This is happening tonight in the nation's capital. And you have to wonder, guys, where things go from here.
I can't imagine that.
Well, Josh, let me ask you, you're down there on the scene, and it appears from our vantage point that we can see bike police. They are slowly moving forward, and the crowd is slowly moving backwards. Is that what you're seeing down there?
That is what we're seeing. Bike police are pushing us back. It's a very good question as to where we are being pushed to. You wonder if police are trying to get the protesters just out of the area of the White House. Because if we were to go up to that intersection that you see there, 16th and I, and take a right, we would be basically at the White House. So that may be part of what we're seeing here, although right now, as has been the case with so much of this protest coverage, it is really difficult to know what is going on while you're down here in the middle of all this chaos on the ground.
We have been drawing the line, Josh, between what has been considered protest activity and what has been lawlessness. And what you're seeing here, this is not editorializing, that would be a peaceful protest. That would be civil disobedience, but we are seeing people not necessarily complying with the orders. If they complied, they'd be out of there. But you see, it is a standoff, but not a violent skirmish, which we've seen a bit of over the last couple of days here and around the country.
That's absolutely correct, Jim. There is, as of 7 o'clock tonight, a curfew in place. So you can make the case that just being out right now, if you are not a member of the media or an essential worker, is unlawful. However, we have not seen any other unlawful behavior since we've been here with the protesters. It has simply been civil disobedience, hands raised, we will not move, and police saying, actually, yes, you will, and coming out here, and now you're seeing the attempt to push everyone back.
Josh, I'm curious, when we saw the Attorney General Bill Barr earlier this afternoon walk out to Lafayette Park, we saw the crowd grow agitated. Do you get the sense that these protesters understand what just took place with the president walking from the White House to St. John's?
I think it's probably a mix. I spoke with a couple protesters who were leaving after they saw the pepper spray earlier, and they said that they were trying to abide by that 7 o'clock curfew, and they said that they were aware of what had happened. They'd been watching it on their phones. Does this whole group know exactly what just happened? It's hard to say, but as you can see, they're chanting and clearly trying to hold the line here and not let police push them back.
And Sean, as you pointed out, You know, the protesters have remained very peaceful, and we did see flashbangs at about 6:45. I'm not sure if tear gas was used. Flashbangs were certainly used to move back the crowd. We now know it's because the president was planning to come out. But Josh, have you seen any
the bike
skirmishes?
The crowds are moving back towards the opposite direction. Josh, what's going on?
Yeah, you know what? It's tough to say. I can tell you just from my experience being out here a couple of the previous nights, we have seen this before. Police push everyone in one direction and then not too long thereafter kind of fall back and let everybody go right back to where they were. As you can see, we're walking right back to the intersection of 16th and I. This is where all those protesters were gathered when police arrived and pushed everybody back. I don't know if they're doing this in response to the protesters refusing to move any further, or maybe there's something else, somewhere else in this downtown area of the city that they need to tend to. It's hard to say, but clearly you see the police stop pushing protesters forward. They've gotten back on their bikes, and it appears as though they're starting to bike away down I Street.
So
it makes you wonder exactly what is the plan tonight, how they plan to enforce this curfew, which, as you know, we are now 25 minutes into.
Yeah.
There still appear to be hundreds of people down there, Josh.
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds, if not thousands. I can tell you that the police deployments have separated these groups of protesters to some extent, Sarah, and we saw some of this the other night, too. Take a look over here. This is the group that we were with that just got pushed back by all those police officers on bikes who just left. But if you look up here a little further up 16th Street, you'll see there's another line of police. They've been here since we arrived. And in fact, we walked around them to get to where we are now. And there's a whole group of protesters behind them. So to answer your question, yes, absolutely. There are still hundreds of people here. And I would say it's most likely over 1,000 when you count up all of these different groups that are in different parts, different intersections of downtown D.C.
I want to give people just a little sense of where Josh is. When you think about the images from last night, Josh spent, as your photog just goes right over Cata Corner there's the AFL-CIO building right in that general vicinity, which last night, there it is right there. The lobby was on fire. There were I would assume Molotov cocktails or some sort of incendiary device thrown inside where that lobby was on fire less than 24 hours ago. Now you see police officer, military police, park police, a whole cadre of various police organizations from our area standing by. They're standing outside that building. But again, Josh, the main line of delineation from last night to now is the fact that you're hearing people passionate. They are still protesting, but we are not seeing where things escalated last night.
That's correct, Jim. We have not seen any of that yet. Granted, last night, the night before, and the night before that, those escalations came later in the day. But what we're seeing now, aside from the fact that we have not seen any protesters do anything that would even mildly be considered violent, is an escalation beyond what we have seen in past days at this time. It's only 7:30, and I mean, take a look. This is stunning. This is a huge line of military police a mere 2 blocks from the White House. Behind them, looks like the officers on horseback just moved, but this is the kind of thing that you don't ever expect to see in this country.
Lafayette Square Park is 1 block from there, and then of course you have the White House behind it if you're trying to get your bearings.
Yeah.
That's exactly right, Blake. That's exactly right.
And D.C. National Guards there is what you're looking at. The entire resources of the D.C. National Guard at the disposal of the mayor. We had spoken earlier down at the Armory with the spokesperson there who said that they would all be out in force. And there was a lot of questions last night when we saw those fires break out. Where were the National Guardsmen? And they were standing line behind U.S. Park Police at Lafayette Square. And, you know, it gets tricky in this area of D.C. Obviously, this is not a state. This is federal territory. So there are a lot of jurisdictions here that have to sort of play hand in hand as to who goes where and does what. And that's why you're seeing certain people take charge of certain areas. But it seems like here there's a strong force of both U.S. Park Police and the National Guard. They're in full riot gear as we're now, in effect, essentially 30 minutes into this curfew. But it is significant significant that so far back from the White House, Friday night we started literally on 1600 Pennsylvania, well into Lafayette Square, and every day since, as the violence escalated, we saw that police line move farther in to downtown D.C. And we'd swing that camera around, Josh, and you see that there's still a fair amount of people out on the streets.
Secret Service.
Yeah.
There are still quite a few people, guys. There are. And if you want to follow me this way, I just think it may be relevant because it appears as though many of the protesters we just saw here in the intersection at 16th and I are now walking away from the White House on 16th. Are they going home? Are they going to a different area? We don't know at this time, but certainly we are seeing some movement.
Just to give people a little situational awareness right now, the curfew is now in effect since 7 o'clock. Metro rail and Metro buses starting to shut down as well, starting at 8 o'clock. Let's go back to Tom Fitzgerald. And Fitz, let's get your take on what we're seeing unfolding right here, right outside of the White House.
Well, you know, we were discussing the presence of the Attorney General out there. Perhaps, though, the official that may have had more of a direct hand on all this is James Murray. If you don't know James Murray, he is the director of the U.S. Secret Service, and anybody who has operated in and around the presidency can tell you the massive layers of security, body security and outer layers that travel with the president at all times. For them to be able to execute what they just did took a massive, not only logistical risk, because you had the President of the United States, as you just saw with Josh, just 2 blocks away from protesters and demonstrators, which showed a massive amount of uncalculated risk. Because anytime you take the President of the United States outside of the White House gates, and he's not in the Beast, the limousine, that's a risk. So for the Secret Service to pull that off tonight, that was of note. That was remarkable. What remains to be seen, of course, is whether or not that gesture, those words the president had to say, the waving of the Bible, was going to have any effect on the people that are out there talking about George Floyd, talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about disenfranchisement and social justice as they have over the last nights. If some of them didn't even know it happened, then it's a legitimate question to ask, what effect did it have?
Lindsay Watts was out in the midst of everything last night, showing what I would say an incredible calm. I have never seen somebody so calm in the face of what was danger at some point last night. Lindsay, where are you now, and what are you seeing?
We just got here to 16th and K. And you can see the huge amount of police officers here. A line of police that in just the last moment moved into the intersection. And let's take them over this way. And you can see the crowd of people. We have a few hundred people here in the street, again, at 16th and K. And a huge amount of law enforcement here. These are DC police officers. And they are holding the line here with these protesters who are in the street 32 minutes after the curfew imposed in D.C.
Lindsay, as you see, when we saw Josh Rosenthal's stance, you had the police on bikes, and they were slowly inching towards the crowd before it was like they backed off, and I don't want to say retreated, but that appears to what they did. Are you seeing sort of that same stalemate from where you are, where the protesters are staring down the police and that sort of dynamic?
Yeah, when we walked up, the police were initially on this sidewalk, and then they moved to the position in the street where you see right now, and there's a little bit more movement that's going on right now. So people are still continuing to be out here and continue to carry on with this rally, again, in violation of this curfew. And now we're seeing a few people here start to go on the move, start to move here down K Street.
Lindsay, this is Blake McCoy. I'm just wondering, have you seen, aside from the curfew violation, have you seen any other unlawful activity from these protesters, or have they been acting peacefully?
No, not since we've been here.
So
we are seeing a little bit of a confrontation right now with a few people here, and the DC police officers, a small group facing off with the police here. But I was out here last night, and just the size of this group is really nothing compared to what we were seeing out at this time yesterday. There were a whole lot more people out in the streets of DC, but, you know, still a sizable group right now as these protests continue in violation of the curfew.
And as we continue to look at these live pictures there outside the Sofitel Hotel there in downtown D.C., let's not forget it was exactly a week ago today that George Floyd died, and today the medical examiner in Minneapolis reversing course on the initial cause of death, ruling Floyd's death a homicide. The medical examiner saying that his heart stopped while police restrained him and compressed his neck. Again, exactly a week ago today. And again, we continue to see these protests throughout the country as curfews are in effect essentially from coast to coast at this hour.
Hey Sean, I just want to get your perspective from your time here at Fox 5 and in DC. Can you think of any time during your time covering news here that we saw something like this to this extent on the streets of the district?
Jim, I've been here for 19 years, and I have never seen anything like this. The only thing that has come close was years ago when there were protests over the World Bank. We geared up to be prepared for that, but there has been nothing like this where we've seen sustained days and days of protest. People who are staying there and being peaceful, It is incredible for me to see, not only here in D.C., but nationwide, to see the protests day after day after day and to see what's going on. Josh Rosenthal, I'm just curious from your perspective where you are. Earlier we saw the police on bicycles sort of pushing people forward, and then they sort of went back. What are they doing now?
So actually, this is the intersection where we saw that happen. This is 16th and K, and just to give you an idea of where we are, we're actually only 1 block from where you saw my colleague, Lindsay Watts, just a couple minutes ago. So this is where we saw those bike police come in. You're looking at now, and then after a brief standoff, they left, and this is what's left in the place. You can see many members of the media as well as some remaining protesters who are defying that curfew order, and some of them, as we're about to show you, are kind of getting up in the faces of these police officers, many of whom are military police, trying to hear exactly what it is that they're saying. What we've heard throughout these protests over time is a lot of George Floyd, I can't breathe. Well, it's a little hard for us to hear what's happening right now. I assume it's more of the same. And there you go, George Floyd. The officers, from what we can see, basically aren't responding. They're staring straight ahead. They're doing what they're here to do. And essentially right now, as far as we can tell, it's to hold the line. But as you see, guys, there is quite a bit of tension here in D.C. tonight.
Josh, I see the District of Columbia patch on some of those officers there. Are they National Guardsmen, can you tell? And the reason I ask is because President Trump did withhold criticizing Mayor Bowser today in her response, because he has criticized some other leaders, and he says if governors don't activate the National Guard, that he will send in the U.S. military. We just heard that on his 6:45 press conference. He has withheld criticizing Mayor Bowser recently, and we should note she did activate the D.C. National Guard yesterday.
Yeah, it's a great question, and judging by the patches, I believe that many of these military police that you see here are members of the D.C. National Guard. I see National Guard patches, and I also see D.C. flags, and you guys can probably see to some extent as well. I can say 1 block away where you just saw Lindsay with another standoff there, it was not military police, those were D.C. police, so it does appear to be a bit of a difference depending on where you are, and of course we are to some extent used to seeing law enforcement personnel in different parts of the city because, yes, it's a city, but it's also the seat of the federal government.
All right. We see that standoff, and certainly things are... Go back over to you as we were talking about just some of the unrest that we've seen in the district. Sue Palka just talked about the D.C. riot of 1991. She texted me about that. But give me a sense, Fitz, of what you're seeing with this right now. It is the tensions are high, but we're not seeing the clashes.
No, I mean, I'll concur with what Sean said, having been here since 2002. This is on the scale of what we saw of the 2002 World Bank protests, what we saw in Pershing Park. However, an important distinction is to be made here. Following the clashes between D.C. police and the protesters back in 2002, D.C. police were sued, and millions of dollars in judgment were ruled against the D.C. police due to the tactics that you used. What you are seeing on the street tonight is a direct result of the reforms that were made in policing practices, especially in contentious demonstrations like the one we're seeing here tonight. And incidentally, I want to circle back to something that was said about the president sparing Muriel Bowser, the mayor of D.C., from any of this criticism. In fact, it was just about 24 hours ago, the president took aim at the mayor on Twitter, writing, "On the bad side, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, who was always looking for money and help, wouldn't let the D.C. police get involved. Quote, not their job, unquote, nice." That, in fact, was not the case. D.C. police explained in the hours after that the jurisdictions that the Park Police had over Lafayette Square, what their area was. I think it was former Chief Ramsey who told me years ago that there's something like 37 police departments that carry a gun and a badge in Washington, D.C. They all have jurisdictions, but I was speaking to some law enforcement sources today, and I asked them, how do you coordinate this? When they step off of Lafayette Park, do you hand it off to D.C.? Does D.C. hand it back to the federal government if they go back onto federal property? And they said, no. It's a lot more cohesive than that. There's a unified command in incidents like this one, which is operational right now and has been since these protests spread out throughout the District of Columbia. That is where all of these operational decisions are being made cohesively. So in that one room, you've got MPD, you've got Park Police, you've got the FBI, you've got the National Guard, and so on and so on. Mayor Bowser did call the Secretary of the Army, McCarthy, today to discuss what we were led to believe was some disappointment on the fact of D.C. officials that they did not see the D.C. National Guard spread out across this city the way anyone who was here on 9/11 could tell you was fully evident on almost every street corner you went that night. That was not the scene. National Guard told us today that they went where they were assigned, and where they were assigned specifically, they said and mentioned Lafayette Park and the White House. D.C. local officials seem to have a different view of that and would like to have them in places which they have now informed D.C. National Guard tonight. And I think the words of Police Chief Peter Newsham today was he would like to see a fuller involvement of the National Guard as they enter our operations this evening. But remember, we're at about 7:40 right now. We're on a clock. Yes, this curfew went into effect at 7 p.m. tonight, but past his prologue, nighttime specifically has a very different effect on what goes on with these protests. So sunrise tonight, sunset I should say, 8:28. We're looking probably about an hour and 15 minutes before they start approaching complete darkness. And we could be seeing a very different situation, let's just say that.
When we see them on the ground there, Fitz, DC police with non-lethal ammunition, you see that red canister on one of the lieutenants there. Those are rubber bullets, essentially, and what you were just describing is known as the JOC. It is the Joint Operations Command Center, which is at DC Police headquarters. It is where all those heads of those jurisdictions, including DC Police Chief Peter Newsham, are monitoring the scene. And that helicopter that we saw earlier, that is U.S. Park Police. It has been the eyes in the skies throughout these past 4 days of protests. It's known as Eagle One, and it also serves for those people who are inside the JOC to monitor exactly what is happening down on the ground. And that's where we find Josh Rosenthal again at that police line. Josh.
Marina, I'm still at 16th and I. Just a few minutes ago, we showed you a very tense scene here with protesters yelling directly in the faces of police. Right now, it's considerably less tense, and that's indicative of what we've seen here for days now. Tensions go up, tensions go down. Follow me over here. I want to talk to a protester real briefly. Thank you so much for joining us. You're out past the D.C. curfew. Explain to me why and why this is so important to you.
Well, I'm not only past the D.C. curfew. I came from L.A., and the reason why this is important to me, because I was raised in a small town in Arizona. I was taught to be patriotic from day one. And honestly, I was, until my experience as a black woman and a sister, a freaking cousin to black people in general in my family, to see people murdered that look like me, it's really fucking sad. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to cuss. It's really tragic.
I understand.
Okay.
I understand the tensions are high. Why did you decide to come to D.C. from L.A. specifically for this?
Because I feel like, well, first I came here to visit, but also this is where the capital is. This is where the decision makers are. And ultimately, I feel like this is where history has always been made. So that's why I'm here. And I feel like if we're not out here, then nothing's going to happen.
Last question I have for you. I think a lot of our viewers at home who have not been down here and have only seen some scenes are very confused about what's happening, and they're concerned about what's happening.
Right.
What do you want them to know about this protest?
I want them to know that it's a peaceful protest. Nobody out here is doing anything. Yet you have all this protection for people who are working. We're out here. We're citizens. We are the ones who need to be protected. I got a smoke bomb thrown at me while standing just like this, and I have a video to prove it too. And that's just what's caught on camera. We're not out here looting. We're not out here looting. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to peacefully protest. The people who are doing that, they're not a part of this. They're part of something different. This is something that I feel like no one will understand unless you're out here and see it for yourselves, because these cameras only tell you one perspective. They don't give the whole story at all.
And that's why we're here talking to you, because we want to get your perspective. And I really appreciate you giving us your time and sharing that with us. Thank you so much. And please be safe out here tonight. Guys, you just heard it here from the protest. They're standing against what they believe to be a great injustice. For now, back to you.
Josh, thank you. And just a quick note, obviously, I think this goes without saying over what you all seen over the last couple of days. Every now and then you may see something, you may hear something that normally you don't hear on TV. Look, there's a lot of passion out there, and for many people, it is a rightful passion. As you heard, for that young woman, it was also very personal. Lindsay Watts standing by once again. Lindsay, where are you and what are you seeing nearby?
We are here at 16th and K, and every few minutes, the people gathered here are getting an alert over a loudspeaker that the 7 p.m. curfew is in effect. Right now, you can see D.C. police clearing 16th Street as they walk towards Lafayette Park right now. But you can still see that there are quite a few officers remaining here. And I know Josh was able to talk to a protester. What's interesting is last night I didn't have any trouble finding people who wanted to talk, who wanted to share their message. Approached maybe 15 people in this crowd, everybody who's around. Nobody wants to talk about why they're out here. And I don't know if it's because they are in violation of the D.C. curfew or perhaps something else, but we're just not having any success chatting with people who are choosing to be out here at this point.
Lindsay,
you can see the Park Police helicopter overhead right now. A very, very different feel from this time yesterday, when we did not see a lot of law enforcement at all in the crowd as we were there near the White House. And now you can see the sheer number of police that are out here. At this point, you can see more cops than you see protesters. And I know that they have help today from military police, obviously Park Police and Secret Service still out here as well. But I know earlier there were some protesters also in DuPont Circle.
Lindsay, we're going to head over to Josh Rosenthal as the
cleared out the
line
circle.
Approaches
And,
Josh.
Josh, go ahead. We can hear you.
Guys, I'm sorry. So I think we're about to witness an escalation here at 16th and I. We're moving to try to stay as safe as we possibly can. Essentially, earlier here, we saw police officers on bicycle come and move a large group of protesters. The protesters refused to go, and the police officers ultimately went away. Well, now we see D.C. police back. It was also D.C. police on the bicycles. They appear to be in full riot gear. I mean, we're talking rocking shin guards, arm guards, masks, batons. And what happened is they pushed most of the protesters to the far side of the intersection here at I-16. However, they waved to us as well as another media crew and said, come this way. I can tell you, we have seen this before. When the police come out with riot gear, I did see some pepper spray. It looks like it's almost like a pepper spray gun out. And it would not surprise me at all, based on my observations, having been out here for several days now, if what happens is police tell these protesters to move, and if they refuse to do so, I think it is entirely possible that we may see pepper spray, because, again, we've seen that before. Yes,
We're
Marina.
looking at, and I don't know if you can turn around and see this, a man in shorts with some green gloves. It looks as though there are 2 people that are being detained right now by D.C. police. Are you seeing more people being detained?
You know what? Since we've been here, I've only seen one other person. It was also a man who was in handcuffs on the side of the street. Police were dealing with him. I do not know why that man was in handcuffs or why those 2 men that you just talked about, Marina, are currently being detained. However, as of now, they're the only ones that I have seen being held by police. Otherwise, it's mostly protesters who have been moved either to this side of the police or to the other side of the intersection.
Hey, Josh,
Josh, let's stay here with you live.
Side of the police line.
Go ahead, Blake.
I said, how many protesters are we talking about that remain on your side of the police line there? You're about 2 blocks towards the White House from where Lindsay Watts was. Police vastly outnumbered protesters by the looks of things where she is. Describe the protester situation there.
That's a fantastic question, and you're right. Right now, it does appear as though police outnumber protesters by a significant margin. I would say that there are fewer than 100 protesters gathered around this intersection. There's another man, by the way, if you look in the middle of the intersection now, who appears to be getting detained by police. I'm not entirely sure why. But that's a great question, Blake, because what we've seen the past few nights is it would appear to us that there were more protesters, many more protesters than police. I even mentioned it, especially Saturday night. We were out here, and at times we saw no police for blocks. Tonight, it's a very different story, at least as of now, and in this intersection. As you can see, there are many, many police officers. You've got Metropolitan Police, you've got military police, park police, you name it, they're here. And absolutely, from what we can tell, they do outnumber protesters here tonight.
From Chief Newsham, and he issued a very direct warning to anybody who was listening. We will arrest you once this curfew is in effect. We will ask for your credentials. If you're not an essential worker, if you are not going to early voting, if you are not the media, you will be detained. It appears if you did not see any violence against those police officers, that is why those people are being removed from the streets.
That would be my assumption, Marina. We have not seen any violence whatsoever. It's possible it happened. Obviously, there are a lot of people down here, but we have not seen any violence, so it is entirely possible that this is enforcement of that 7 o'clock curfew.
You're going to see Josh Rosenthal standing by there. So as you're checking in right now, it is 7:51. The D.C. curfew has been in effect for 51 minutes right now. We are starting to see mass transit in this city starting to shut down a little bit. We saw a bit of an escalation right around 6:30 tonight in Lafayette Square when the crews deployed what appeared to be some sort of a deterrent. Whether it was tear gas, we don't know, but that cleared the path for the president to make that trip across Lafayette Square over towards St. John's Episcopal Church, which was set ablaze, at least the basement last night. Did a brief, said a few words that were very similar to what he said in the Rose Garden. Then he and his associates, his advisors, went back to the White House. Tom Fitzgerald standing by once again. Fitz, what do you have?
Well, as we're looking at this police riot right now, it's important to remember that these protests in large part have almost had 2 sides to this coin. Keep in mind what we saw today when we were down at Lafayette Park near the White House was a dramatically different group of folks than what we're seeing being arrested right now. What we saw today were probably about 200 to 300 protesters, which marched in an orderly fashion around the White House complex, not through Lafayette Park because it was closed, but with D.C. police leading the way with an SUV with the lights on, and then another SUV at the end of that group, which stretched about a block and a half, ensuring their safety as they made circular rounds down H Street, down 6th Street, and then up and around again. So as night falls, that is the critical part, because here we are going now, nearly an hour since this curfew went into effect. There are elements which they said their own intelligence last night precipitated last night's curfew, which they are very concerned about. Because when the mayor and the police chief were talking about outside agitators last night, nightfall is primarily when that activity tends to see an uptick. So in order for them to get control of these streets right now, they need to clear out a lot of those people. They need to clear out all of those people, but they need to get the people out of the way right now so they can deal with what they believe to be the more radical elements.
We are seeing on the left side of your screen, you heard the swells of applause. There is apparently an organized protest standing by right there at that point. Marina, what are you seeing from your angle?
Yeah, Jim, exactly that. I'm looking to see exactly the location here in downtown D.C., but we see there that there is a large presence there of what seems to be a scheduled protest on the steps here.
We should point out, Marina, that's New York. We're looking at Brooklyn, New York right now. Let's go back to D.C. if we can. I mean, clearly there's a lot going on in New York City, but right now D.C. is what we're focusing on as you see the crowds. There we go. We're back to D.C. Go ahead, Marina. Sorry.
And again, here go the protesters as they've been dispersed, essentially ousted there from the downtown area. And it makes sense, right? We saw the president deliver those remarks just before the 7 o'clock hour from the White House. We saw the tear gas there dispersing, and we believe now that the Attorney General went out to Lafayette Park to survey essentially if the president could make that trek from the White House to St. John's safely. There were no protesters in the vicinity. There were double police lines, U.S. Park Police up above, and we see the protesters here now walking through the streets of the district, essentially 55 minutes into this curfew. And in this protest right here, Jim, I do not see any law enforcement. It appears that they are walking down a street. There should be no traffic as we are into a curfew at this hour, but again, no law enforcement where we're seeing this walk happen.
All right, so we should point out, you're hearing crowds right now. I believe that's the audio coming from one of the many protests we're seeing in New York City. But as you look at the screen right now, we are back in the district, and you can see, do we know where exactly? Is this our Fox 5 crew we're looking at right now on the screen? Just to give us a little perspective as to where we are.
Yeah, let's remind our viewers, Jim, that we are taking shots nationally from across the country as well as here in the district. We have crews pretty much everywhere, but it is hard to tell exactly where we are as this is exactly a fluid situation, and we see these protesters continue to make their way, and hopefully we can get some clarification as to exactly where this is happening now. But you hear those helicopters up above the signs there. It looks peaceful. This is definitely a peaceful demonstration there as they cross there the median onto the other side, and I did see some traffic there, so I'm curious to know if maybe these protesters may have crossed over into Virginia. Is that a possibility here?
It could be. Again, I'm just hoping that we because we have so many crews fanned out around the area, and certainly I think
looks like it's behind the National Mall.
Yeah.
Somewhere around the Martin Luther King Memorial. But
oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
By Ohio Drive. I don't want to say that with certainty.
It looks like it, though.
But it seems like this is where that's happening. If I'm guessing, this is somewhere near the National Mall.
All right. Hey, Marina, let me just jump in here to let all of our viewers know you're watching Fox 5 live coverage of the protests across D.C. after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We saw President Trump speaking a little while ago. Then he made a trip across Lafayette Square Park after they cleared the protesters out of the way so we could go outside of St. John's Episcopal Church. You're seeing a Guy Fawkes mask there, which has been a symbol for many of the other elements of these protests out there. But you're seeing these crowds move through the National Mall, and that's, Marina mentioned that she does believe they're heading over towards, or they're in the vicinity of the MLK Memorial, and that appears to be the case. Although, if I am incorrect, certainly somebody let me know. But we should say we're going to stay with this until 8:30, both on Fox 5 and on Fox 5 Plus.
Again, we continue to watch. It was interesting to see, Jim, as we stayed downtown with Josh Rosenthal and Lindsey Watts, and hopefully we can go back to them in some short fashion. Here we go. There you see the Washington Monument.
There it
yes,
is.
in effect, we are approaching, I believe, the National Mall there. Those
Move in and begin pushing protesters in that direction. They actually ordered us and other media entities behind the police line. At one point recently, we were actually trapped back a ways behind an intersection. We asked if we could come through. Ultimately, they did allow us. And you can see what's happening now.
I'm going to give you one more.
Police officers. Well, hold on. I have them right here, sir.
I need to see credentials.
So what's happening here is police officers, including this gentleman, are asking us for our credentials, which we have, and they said it's okay. These gentlemen are there are security guards, and we are credentialed media.
Right now you're in a secure area, so they can wait for you outside there.
Lieutenant, so our security guards need to be in an outside area?
You must have a credentials on to be here.
Okay, so what we're being told by police is that we, the news crew, go ahead guys, go ahead. What we're being told by police is that myself and my photographer, Paris Smith, are allowed to stay here because we're credentialed media. However, Fox 5 gave us security guards to come down here for our safety. Police will not let those security guards into this area because they don't have media credentials because they're not members of the media. So they are still over there. We're still safe. They're within eyesight, but that's some of the confusion that you encounter when you're covering a protest like this. Let's go back to the action here. What you see are police. It appears as though surrounding some protesters who decided not to leave the area when that 7 o'clock curfew kicked in. So you see, people, it's important to know we have not seen any violence from protesters or police for that matter since we've been here. But you have protesters in the middle there surrounded by police holding up signs, holding up an American flag I see and yelling, "George Floyd, George Floyd, George Floyd." So this is yet another example of one of those tense standoffs that as of now is very peaceful, and you hope it stays that way. However, like Marina mentioned earlier, and like we saw on Fox 5 earlier today, Chief Peter Newsham said that if people are not cooperating with this 7 o'clock curfew, they will make sure it's enforced. And I would have to think, guys, that this is the early stages of watching that enforcement play out here on I Street, just west, not even a block west of the White House.
Hey, Josh, we've all covered enough protests to know that some of these protesters don't mind if they get arrested. In fact, that may be the point for some of them, is to prove a point and to allow themselves to be arrested for the cause that they are out there for.
Yeah, I think that's likely what we're seeing here because clearly police have said the curfew is in effect right now. You must leave. They are allowing people to leave. However, clearly these people have refused to do so. I now see gentlemen sitting on the ground. So what you said about people wanting to get arrested to prove a point may very well be the case here because it appears as though that's what's playing out.
Yeah, it's important to note it doesn't necessarily mean they are provoking police.
That's correct. It does not necessarily mean that they're provoking police. It means that they're choosing to stay here and they feel as though they're making a point. As we heard from a protester who we interviewed not too long ago who said that she had come here to D.C. from L.A. because she sees what she believes to be injustice in this country and she wanted to fight it right here in our nation's capital. Take a look back here. More people standing, angry, screaming, yelling, but peaceful. Some even sitting. And this is just that kind of tense standoff that we have right now. One more time, I want to mention, different from what we've seen the past few nights, very, very clearly at this point, there are far more police officers here than protesters. That is different from what we have observed, our crews have observed out here for the past several days. And right now, listen to this. It's almost an eerie silence. I believe police are saying something. I'm going to see if I can sneak in and hear it.
Go for it. Let us know.
I won't go far.
You're fine.
Do you know what he's
Your guys
saying?
are right there.
Do you know what he's saying?
Hi. Can't hear me.
What's this like for you guys?
I'm good. Hey, hop back here. I asked you to. Thank you very much.
I had to
I
try.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
I know you're trying good. I like it. Stay right here.
Josh, we really appreciate your level of calmness and just sincere, genuine appreciation for people out there. We saw Evan Lambert was out also in downtown D.C. and hopefully we can take his shot here in a second and get a sense of where he is.
Yeah, Marina, is his camera the one we saw with the
There's
lights?
Yeah, Evan's right there.
Okay.
Evan, where are you and what are you seeing?
Hey, Evan, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're at Connecticut and I right now, and you see this line of police just behind where we are. We really have not seen, from our perspective over here, any protesters. This is mainly media, we understand, but you can see that the lines of the police, there are more of them than what we saw out here last night. And you know they're moving right now. You can see some of the police in riot gear running this way. It's unclear exactly what they're doing, but clearly trying to clear the area. This group right here that you're seeing is mostly media, we understand. So clearly there is a decision to move these officers back and forth. We're not quite sure where they're going, if they're responding to something in particular, or if they're changing the line. But that's what we're watching right now here at Connecticut and I Street. Really, I think just on the other side of where Josh is. We're going to try to find out a little bit more about what's going on, but you can see that there are definitely many police. We've seen a lot more of what appears to be the National Guard and military than there was yesterday. You can see that escalation.
Over the weekend, all the violence happened in Lafayette Square Park. That's where it was centered, and that's because that's where all the protesters were gathering well into the night after darkness. It's notable that today the strategy was clearly to push protesters as far away from Lafayette Park. And of course, as you push them away, it now becomes a wider and wider perimeter. So even if you have the same number of protesters, they're now much more spread out around a much wider perimeter. So it's easier for police to control if they have the manpower, which they clearly do tonight.
There was so much speculation as to what we were seeing all that action for as well earlier tonight. I want to look, just Evan, we're going to check back in with you in a moment, but as we look at the left side of your, or right side of your screen rather, you are seeing a large group of protesters heading down through the National Mall. There, you can hear how loud it is. There are a lot of people heading down towards, it appears to be over towards the World War II Memorial, an area that was damaged last night, not by protesters, but by vandals. And it appears that in that general vicinity, there are, judging by some other accounts on social media, there is a sizable law enforcement presence over there at the World War II Memorial over there on the National Mall.
And as these protesters are now on the move, you know, I drove through Logan Circle, through Shaw today, just to get a look at what things were like. And many businesses remained closed today. They didn't even open up today. Many restaurants, CVS, for example, they were all boarded up. Even in areas that hadn't necessarily been hit last night, they were preventatively boarded up in anticipation of more protests today.
You know, one thing that strikes me there is that it's 8:06 right now, and you guys hear the honking of the cars there. There's a lot of traffic despite that curfew still being in effect. Lindsay Watts standing by in downtown DC. Lindsay.
Hey guys, we are at 16th and L now, and we are surrounded by law enforcement here. We're about 3 blocks from the White House. You can see that straight ahead. And between the White House and us, a whole lot of law enforcement. We have DC police, we have federal agents, DEA, right over there. And you can see further down L Street that way, more police. Further down 16th over here, we have police and not a lot of protesters, but let's walk across the street, because these ladies who are out here said that they would chat with us for a little bit. And guys, I want to ask you, why did you want to be out here tonight?
Well, regardless of what we've been seeing on the street, I looked on the news last night and I asked my mom, have you ever seen anything like this? Like, have you seen it get this bad? And she said she's never experienced it. Me, as a 20-year-old, seeing this go down, there's no way that I can sit back and just let things happen. As a minority sitting back and to let things happen. There are people who try to have a say and say, well, Black Lives Matter, but don't do anything about it. I think the reason why I'm out here is because it's also so beautiful, the different colors that we get to see. White and black, doesn't matter. It's not about race. It's about a human life. And just because one person gets incarcerated for their wrongdoings is not enough for the millions of lives that have been taken away. So that's why I'm out here.
Were you guys with a larger group earlier?
We were not. When we got here, we were told curfew's at 7 o'clock, and we may be detained if we stay out past that time. But
Do you plan to stay out?
Of course.
Of course.
You're not leaving?
No, because they're trying to enforce a curfew, putting it randomly so that they can silence our voice and have the silencer set.
We're here for humanity and humanity only.
right, ladies. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it. I mentioned earlier it was a little hard to get people to talk to us, perhaps because of the curfew that's now in effect.
Right.
But you can hear that some protesters are staying out here.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Hey, let's go over to Josh Rosenthal. Josh, heavier presence than there was about 5-10 minutes ago.
There absolutely is, Jim, and I think we're about to see a bit of an escalation here. Essentially, as you said, that curfew kicked in at 7 o'clock. You can see here in the middle of this group of police, there are protesters who have refused to move. They say that they are disobeying peacefully to make their point. However, I think that they are most likely about to be arrested, because take a look over here. You can see police just pulled up with these 3 vans. You can see that they've got stairs, and I can see quite a few zip ties there on the floor, and it appears as though police are preparing, most likely, to round up these protesters who have refused to leave and load them up into these DC police vans and take them in. I do think it's important to note that while there is obviously quite a bit of police activity here, and I believe we're about to witness some arrests, everything here has been incredibly peaceful. And in fact, on both sides, we've heard protesters speaking with police, and while they are clearly upset with each other, there hasn't been any conflict. And here you go, guys. You're watching it live on Fox 5. I believe this is the first arrest of this group of protesters here on I Street, just by I and 16th Street, about 2 blocks from the White House. So there's that gentleman in the red shirt. He has not fought police at all. It appears as though they are now taking off his bandana. Behind him, there's another person peacefully being carried away by police. And I think what we're about to see is these guys get zip-tied, most likely behind their back. That does appear to be the case right now with the gentleman in the red shirt. And essentially, police are just going in and they are pulling these protesters in one at a time. You can see a bit of a disagreement here. That I would not call much of a conflict, but I can tell you guys, because I think this is really important for context, that's the most conflict that we have seen with our own eyes out here all day. And essentially, you've got this group of protesters still sitting in the middle of all of these police officers, and you see members of the D.C. Police Department and Metropolitan Police pulling protesters out of there, and in this case, literally pulling this woman out who was sitting there in the middle of I Street, and wow, police are literally dragging her to the police van. It actually looks like another police officer stepped in and said, "Stop." I believe this woman was allowed to kind of readjust her clothing. We're being told, told back up. Yes, sir. No problem. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I understand. They're moving us back. We move back.
Back over here now.
Back over here? Okay.
See the pole?
This is my buddy. I'm making friends out here.
You're not helping me.
I apologize. I thought we were in a good place. So we are moving, but you can still see the action here. That woman who was literally dragged out of this crowd is now sitting there pretty calmly, and I would assume that just like everybody else, she's eventually going to be picked up, zip-tied behind her back, and loaded into one of these vans. Actually, the first person who we saw get zip-tied is still standing over there. That's the gentleman in the red shirt. Yes, sir. I apologize. I didn't mean to disobey. I apologize.
Hey,
sincerely,
Josh,
I didn't mean to.
As we see these pictures,
Yes.
and this is going to take quite a while, I just want to, for a second here, the procedure of this, these are arrest vans, obviously, and you're going to see, like you said, these people be zip-tied and placed into the back of these vans. And essentially what happens now is that DC police will collect all of their property on them. That includes wallets, glasses. If you have a bicycle, which we saw someone there, they will detail all that equipment in a list, and you can see that police officer there writing it down. You'll also look for a dry erase board, and there you will see that names are being written down. It will be the person's name and as much information as they can have of that person, and then a photograph will be taken of the arrested person at the scene with what they're wearing, in case this does then lead to any sort of trial, whether that be a civil trial, a criminal trial, whatever. But there needs to be evidence to remark that moment and the evidence that was recovered at the scene, who these people were and what they were wearing at the time, in case they need to match them up later in a criminal trial if there is to be any violence that is correlated with that defendant, or if they're just issued a citation and then they will be asked to appear before a judge. And then these people also have the right to sue the Department of DC Police if they feel that their rights were at some point violated, and they'll all go back to this moment right here, which is the arrest moment, and you see that dry erase board right there in that officer's hand, and essentially here in a second, that board will be placed in front of that person with the red shirt. They will be photographed, and that is how the conclusion of that arrest will happen here in minutes.
Hey, Marina, let's go back to the other shot we saw a moment ago. I want to go back to over towards the White House, where you see many people walking down the streets. I hear hands up. Hands up, don't shoot. Reminiscent of the Michael Brown protests out of Ferguson, Missouri a few years ago. They are passing the White House at this moment from that vantage point. As you spin around, you get a sense. Hopefully, we can get a sense of the crowd. It's a large crowd. Not sure how dense it is as they walk by one of the guard shacks not too far away from the White House and the EOB, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which is, of course, the building adjacent to the White House.
It looks like right now, Jim, I just want
no doubt about that.
They walked past the Daughters of American Revolution Constitution Hall, so they are in fact walking north there into downtown D.C., essentially where Josh is standing now. So they will be confronted by that D.C. police presence, which was already in effect starting to make arrests for those people who were in violation of curfew. But again, like the point that Blake had made earlier tonight, and we see this happen all the time at the U.S. Capitol, people know that they will be arrested, but they believe that their rights and their right to protest is worth the arrest, and that's essentially what we're seeing happen, because for now, what we're looking at is peaceful.
Blake, hey, if we can, Blake McCoy is, by the way, if you're watching right now, Jim Lokay, Blake McCoy, Sean Yancey, Marina Morocco standing by, and Blake has a question for Marina, so let's go back over to Blake.
Yeah. You know, Marina, I saw a lot of people wondering what difference does a curfew make? Because people aren't going to pay attention to it anyway, and they're going to stay out here. But we saw those arrests being made of peaceful protesters, and that highlights the difference that the curfew makes. It gives officers grounds to make an arrest, because those people, under normal circumstances, were not committing any crime. Not listening to police officers' orders telling you to move out of the way is not necessarily a crime if you're not doing anything wrong. But now there's a curfew in effect in the district since 7 p.m. So that would be the grounds to make an arrest there, that they're now violating the mayor's curfew order.
Absolutely. In effect, that's civil disobedience, right? So you are committing a crime. It is not a violent crime, but you're committing a crime. And the chief was very clear today when that curfew was put in place. We will make arrests if you are in violation of this curfew. And Blake, it's 8:16. This didn't start happening at 7:05 or 7:10. It started an hour into this curfew is when we started to first see people being detained there. And again, with that dry erase board, time will be documented. All that will be taken into consideration. But they were in clear defiance of that curfew. There were several dispersal announcements which need to be made before there's an arrest of a mass demonstration. There were several announcements that were also made that the curfew was in effect. Also is part of protocol before you make an arrest for mass demonstrations. And just quickly, an observation here in D.C. If there is any city in this country that is prepared for mass demonstrations, is without a doubt the District of Columbia, not just D.C. police, but all the other federal jurisdictions, which on nearly daily basis, we may not see them or hear them contend with these demonstrations. We saw Pershing Park, which was a huge demonstration, which resulted in mass arrests happening at Freedom Plaza, Pershing Park, a number of years ago. We saw the inauguration protests, which turned into violent riots back in 2017. Also mass arrests happening then. And again, today, on the fourth day of protests here in the District of Columbia, we are going to see mass arrests. I believe the number of arrested people yesterday, 88, but the majority of them correlated with some sort of looting or violence. Today, a very different number. It will probably be much larger, but like you said, Blake, and you pointed out, this will not be for violent arrest, but it'll be for disobedience to that order of the curfew.
So, look, Jim, walk us through what we're seeing in the little box, because this is what we saw at about I guess right about 7 o'clock.
Yeah. So this, by the way, that is not live video on the right. That is the photo op that the president brought a few of his advisors over across Lafayette Square over towards St. John's Episcopal Church. The president did not deliver prepared remarks. He reiterated some of the things that he had said earlier. What many people are pointing out is the fact that there was a large attempt by law enforcement to clear out Lafayette Square, and at that point, again, the protests, while they were heated, they were not violent. We were not seeing vandalism and looting like we saw in that general area last night. I want to go over, as we look at the left side of the screen, I want to bring Sean back into the conversation here, because as we look, Sean, Blake made the point that a lot of these protesters you're seeing a lot of young protesters out there. You're seeing a lot of signs invoking the name of George Floyd. We heard the hands up, don't shoot chant. I mean, this really is, look, it sounds cliche to say, but you're looking at when we're not seeing major problems, that's democracy in action there. And that's what we're used to seeing in D.C. are people raising their voices.
I think we also need to focus on the whole reason, again, that the people are out there. It is George Floyd, it is Tamir Rice, it is Ahmaud Arbery. Certainly, George Floyd's death sparked this recently, but those people are out there for the reason to put an end to police brutality, to look for some sort of racial harmony and justice and understanding. And we've also talked about this before, that the crowd is incredibly diverse. And the only way that we're going to move forward as a people is if we come together, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. It just can't be, racism is not a problem for one particular race. And I think that's one of the things that we need to focus on as we look at these crowds of young people, old people, whoever out there. We're seeing so many different people. And again, these protests that we're seeing are peaceful. And I think for the most part, what we've seen are the peaceful protests across the United States. Is when it starts to get dark and the opportunists come out and they start to do things that, have nothing to do with what these people right here are protesting for. And I think that's what we need to continually remember. That is why they're out there. What I do find interesting is that, as you guys have mentioned, we are past the curfew now by like an hour and 20 minutes. We saw some of the arrests begin to happen. Are there enough DC police? Are there enough wagons? What are they going to do? They can't arrest all of these people. Right. So it's going to be interesting to see how they handle this as the night drags on.
That's a great point, Sean. We are seeing crowds that they overtake the amount of police presence that we're seeing. And right here in this area, you don't see what we saw, Josh saw, where essentially these protesters were cornered. These protests here are continuing. They are peaceful. They are walking down the street. Yes, they are in defiance of the curfew. But it seems as though, Sean, and my guess is with U.S. Park Police helicopter watching over these crowds, they know where they're headed, that the police at this point are allowing these protests to continue despite that 7 p.m. curfew.
And Marina, this is Blake. In my experience with these protests, as long as the protesters are listening to police and keep moving,
right,
they don't get arrested. It's when they stop and turn around and confront the police and refuse to move, that is when the arrest.
And by the way, that reminded me of Josh Rosenthal and his interaction with police a little while ago. He is standing by once again where, Josh, just to refresh your memory where you're standing right now.
Sure. So, Jim, we are just west of the intersection at 16th and I. That's about 2 blocks from the White House. And essentially, we're seeing more of exactly what I showed you the last time you guys came to me. Take a look over here. You have protesters who have refused to move. They have refused to comply with D.C.'s 7 o'clock curfew that was just instituted today. They're surrounded by police officers in riot gear. It's important to mention that everything has been very peaceful, both on the parts of protesters as well as police. Everything that we've seen so far. And what's happening is police are walking into this circle and they're pulling people out 1 or 2 at a time. And then if you follow me over here to the right, you can see that they're kind of being booked. In this area here, they're being zip-tied and processed. And their pictures have been taken, just like Marina described to you earlier. And I believe we're going to start seeing some people most likely loaded into these vans here in a little bit. There's a gentleman there who refused to move out of that circle, so police dragged him. I don't want to be flippant about this, but as far as arrests go, guys, this is a remarkably low tension situation, if that makes sense. Compared to what we have seen here the past few nights when protesters and police really appeared to be at each other's throats, and there was screaming and there was pepper spray and rubber bullets and water bottles being thrown at police. We're not seeing that here tonight at all. You have peaceful protesters who have refused to obey these orders, and as you see here, they are peacefully being arrested and put into these vans.
And Josh, one thing quickly to remark, I saw you're seeing continued arrests here. On the left of your screen, there was a man, a DC police officer with a white shirt. If you can pan over, you'll see him, and there's Assistant Chief Robert Conti. And if you see that man right there on the telephone, That is Assistant Chief Jeff Carroll. He is the Assistant Chief in charge of Homeland Security for the Department of DC Police, for Metropolitan Police Department, to his right on the screen there. Again, you have Conti, also an Assistant Chief. These are the two men who are directly underneath Chief Peter Newsham. And if I were a betting woman, which I'm not, I would say that Chief Carroll is on the phone right now, likely with the JOC, which is that Unified Command Center, which I would believe either the mayor, Chief Newsham, or both of them right now are monitoring this situation, also looking at the helicopter shot as they watch the protesters continue. But you can see there that whatever is happening is well within the accord of DC Police, as you have two chiefs now on the scene supervising what is in effect a mass arrest.
Of all of our reporters, we should point out Josh is closest to the White House, so that's why we're seeing these arrests. This is I and 16th Street. 16th is the street that if you drive around D.C., you look straight down 16th, and that's where you see the White House.
Yeah.
So that's where Josh is. He's a few blocks from the White House there on 16th.
Hey, just to give you all some idea of the manpower that we're seeing out there, because we've seen, as was pointed out before, I know Blake had mentioned about seeing the various insignias on the police uniforms, where we see a lot of D.C. Members of D.C. Police, which was just pointed out. Apparently, a senior defense official telling Fox 5 that there's about 250 MPs, military police members, on their way to D.C. right now from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. So they're supplementing all of this going on right now as you take a look at another person being arrested out there as they continue to detain people who may be violating the curfew. At this point, clearly they are. We should also point out I just talked with somebody up at Washington Hospital Center, a nurse supervisor up there, told me that there's concern tonight just in terms of getting people around, getting employees to and from the hospital, because we had Metro shut down early tonight.
Right.
Metro Rail closed at 8. Buses closing at 9 o'clock tonight. So we're seeing a lot going on right now. We want to head back over to Evan Lambert. And Evan, we've been asking everybody this, but please just give us a sense of where you are and take it from there.
Yeah, Jim, so we're at Farragut Square right now. We saw several hundred protesters just walk through here, and we don't know exactly where they're headed. It is north. I can tell that it looks like north up K Street. So we're following them right now. We did not see them engaging with any police on the way when they were in the square. But we are kind of losing the crowd at this point, but we're trying to catch up to them. Several hundred people were coming from the west and are walking north up K Street, or crossing K Street. And I should say, I believe up I Street that they're walking up right now on the other side of Farragut Square. You can see some military vehicles there in the intersection, and some protesters now standing in the middle of the intersection. And we see police with shields as well that are really just maintaining their ground right now. We don't see them moving toward the protesters. But again, several hundred protesters are walking north away from the White House right now. And so we're kind of trying to watch and see what may happen. Of course, all these people are violating that curfew that went into effect at 7 o'clock, and they've been warned that they could be arrested. So we're really just waiting to see what DC police do at this point. And obviously you heard from Josh and saw that there have been some isolated arrests. We have not seen any for the last hour or so, but we are seeing people walk up 17th Street.
And Evan, are they walking on their own, or are they being directed by police?
They're walking on their own. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a military helicopter fly over right now. See soldiers in fatigues that are kind of hanging out of the helicopter. I didn't see that yesterday. So it definitely looks a little bit different, but we do see some people in this intersection right here. They're saying, hands up, don't shoot. And so we're going to keep continuing to follow the crowd up 17th Street. You haven't seen police advance toward this crowd here as they continue up 17th Street north.
All right,
Evan, we're going to go back to Josh Rosenthal.
Right now.
Josh Rosenthal, I believe, is still at I and 16th Street. Josh, are the arrests continuing where you are?
The arrests are continuing, and it's still just as peaceful. So the last time I talked to you guys, take a look behind me. You can see here, this is where protesters are being brought over. They're being processed. They're being put in zip ties, hands behind their back. and then they're eventually being taken into these vans. You can see quite a few police officers here. Many of these officers are the same ones who we saw when we were in the middle of the intersection at 16th and I, which is just behind where all of these police vans are. They moved the protesters over in this direction. They set up several police barriers, almost, for lack of a better term, trapping the group in between police. The group of protesters all sat down, and now they're being pulled out one at a time, possibly two at a time, to be arrested. You still hear people in that group over there saying, "No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. George Floyd, I can't breathe." Many of the same chants that we've heard over and over again for days now, but this is certainly a different outcome. I mean, it is only 8:30. Past nights, the real conflict really didn't start until past this point, for the most part. And tonight you're seeing a pretty peaceful situation, but arrests being made at 8:30 p.m.
And Josh, for viewers just joining us, the point you made is important. Peaceful protest, the reason they're being arrested is because it's now after 7 o'clock, which was the mayor's curfew time. You have not seen any other reason for arrest from these protesters, at least from your vantage point. Is that correct?
From our vantage point, we have not seen anything but peaceful protest along the lines of what you're seeing here. And for the record, from our vantage point, we have not seen any aggression from police either. Here, clearly, you have a little bit of a problem, a bit of a verbal conflict, but certainly, guys, this doesn't compare at all to what we've seen the past few nights here by the White House.
Right, it's night and day, literally and figuratively, there at the White House. And those protesters, we've been on the air live with this since about 6:30.
Yeah.
Those protesters were given every opportunity to leave. It's clear they did not want to leave and that they wanted to be arrested. I can't speak for them, but It does seem that they wanted to be arrested to prove a point, that they were not going to obey the mayor's order.
What has been pointed out before, I mean, that is nothing new when you have protests of this size. I mean, they are prepared to do this. Many people take part in many protests, and they're familiar with the legal machinations and everything else along that sense.
And many of these charges do end up getting dropped. I mean, these are not serious charges they're being arrested under. What they are is cause for the police to remove them from this area.
Right. And again, as you mentioned, we are not seeing, we saw a few instances where there was some level of resistance there, but think about the crowds that we saw, again, back to Lafayette Square at about, 4:30. It started to build up around 6 o'clock. We saw the gas deployed to clear that out for the president making his way across the square, and clearly a lot of the protesters ended up in the streets. And as we said many times before, I mean, there's a line between people who are exercising their First Amendment right, which we are clearly seeing right now. That's what we're seeing. We are not seeing the absolute chaos and destruction and violence that erupted last night, and has been mentioned many times, including the young woman that Josh Rosenthal spoke to, who came in from Los Angeles. She said, that's not who we are. We're here for a message. We're here to fight for our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this country. So again, we're taking a look over at Connecticut and I Street, where Josh Rosenthal has been. We saw a large group of people heading over towards the National Mall some time ago. They were marching over on the roads, I believe, over towards Ohio Drive, not too far away from the Rock Creek Park area, over Rock Creek Parkway rather, over towards the Kennedy Center. Actually, that'd be more accurate to say Kennedy Center, but.
And Jim, bus service and train service is now over, right? So it's unclear how those protesters are going to get home or wherever they would like to go, because public transportation has now been shut down.
Rail system shut down at 8, Metro bus closing at 9 o'clock. And so that's where things stand right now. And by the way, just for people wondering, if you're watching this and you have to get around tomorrow, that's at least the plan for today. We don't know how that can change, as we learned with the mayor saying one moment there was not going to be a curfew, and then I was out. I was taking a walk through Friendship Heights last night. Got the alert that the curfew was in effect for 11 o'clock last night, and tonight it was 7 o'clock. So it's been all over the place right now. Checking on some of the other cities. I know a while ago we looked at New York City. You are seeing large crowds assembling there. We are not seeing mass chaos everywhere. There has once again looting reported in some cities around the country. We have not heard of anything substantial happening in our area just yet.
Hey Jim, I'm seeing the Washington Post reporting. Blake mentioned this earlier. Yesterday, 44 people were charged with felony rioting. This again, the Washington Post reporting. When they appeared at Superior Court today, the U.S. Attorney's Office dismissed all those rioting charges against most of those defendants, and those are felony charges.
Wow. Yeah, that's actually surprising,
So
Marina, because when I said a lot of these charges get dropped, I meant the peaceful protesters who are arrested and taken away in order to clear a scene. It's surprising given what's been going on and the hard stance that has been urged by some, the pressure on these lawmakers. It's surprising that those federal charges were dropped so quickly.
Well, it's very hard to prosecute these things, and it's a lot of resources, it's a lot of time, and you have to imagine a lot of these people have their faces concealed, either because of gas masks or because they're wearing masks given the pandemic, but that makes it harder also on proving that beyond a reasonable doubt, this was the person that committed that crime. And if you want to really strain those resources, we saw this happening over inauguration. So again, this is what happens. You have people who come into the streets of DC, they cause mass chaos, destruction, damage dozens, millions of dollars in property. Businesses that were already hurt because of this pandemic now kicked when they're down, with people who have no other will other than to cause chaos and damage. If you want to get your point across, we're seeing these demonstrators do so peacefully, and they are being arrested, likely with a misdemeanor charge, and they understand from what you're seeing that this is happening and this is the consequence. But you don't go out there and you don't start fires and complete lawlessness, and it's sad that these charges are dropped when people need to be held responsible for such violent acts.
Hey, just to anybody who's here in the D.C. area, if you're watching us tonight, if you're in the city, regardless of where you are, if you see anything going on in your neighborhoods, feel free to let us know on social media, hashtag it with Fox5DC, because obviously we have cameras in the district right now, in the district proper, where we saw a lot of the activity last night, but certainly we want to have the pulse of the people wherever we go. There were large protests earlier tonight in Manassas and Prince William County. There was one in Oxon Hill in Prince George's County. So again, we're keeping our eye on all forms of social media right now, just to get a sense if there's any other precautions, any other messages that we need to get out there, because last night we saw everything unfolding in D.C., but in Friendship Heights on Wisconsin Avenue, it turned out to be a pretty significant episode of looting at the CVS up here, at the Mazda Galleria nearby, at a grocery store, which I can tell you they had nothing to do with any protest. I think it was just people up there looking to cause some destruction.
Yeah, we saw that in Georgetown as well.
Yeah.
To the night looting. I am curious, though, because we see that D.C. police have, for the most part, fixated in this location that we're looking at now, where Josh is, and then you have that large demonstration that continues to walk through the streets of downtown D.C., and it seems as though police are nowhere near them, and unclear if there's any intent to make any sort of mass arrest, to stop them, to disperse them, but you see them there continuing to assemble well into effect into this curfew. It is now 8:36.
It does appear that the ones who are walking, the protesters who are walking, are being given space to do so.
Yes, which is not uncommon, and that's a good thing.
Police are not interested in making arrests. It's clear, especially not on this scale. It's remarkable the law enforcement presence we're seeing tonight, though, because I mean, Marina, even if they had wanted to take this approach over the weekend, it didn't appear they had the manpower. And now they certainly do, between D.C. Police, the D.C. National Guard, and the numerous federal agencies that are out there.
I think the mayor and the chief had to make a decision. Do we put our men and women in harm's way? It was such a volatile situation. People were so angry, and it clearly turned violent, that you don't just dump police officers and order them into the streets when they are clearly outnumbered. We saw that with the fires yesterday. D.C. Fire could not get to St. John's Church in time as that fire continued to burn, because simply they were outnumbered, and you don't want to put those people at risk. At the end of the day, it's just property. I will tell you, Blake, over the weekend when this started on Friday, CDU platoons were called in, and they were told to stand by. Those are the civil disturbance units, and much of these people, police officers that you're seeing, are part of those platoons. They are trained specifically for civil disturbances. These men and women know what they are doing, and you're seeing many of them here on this scene. And I did see earlier the Special Operations Division captain in charge also on that scene. So clearly there is protocol here that is being followed, and they are there with the direct top brass supervising this scene in joint cooperation with other federal jurisdictions that are also on the scene. We saw Park Police, D.C. National Guard, the uniformed division of the Secret Service, and D.C. Police handling that one intersection that we keep focusing on. And I think right now they are approaching here Thomas Circle, if I'm not mistaken. Do you see that crowd there continue to walk down the streets of downtown D.C.?
Yeah, that's Thomas Circle that they're approaching there on the left. That white building looks like the Washington Plaza Hotel if you're trying to get your bearings.
Yeah.
Hey guys, one of the things I thought was interesting earlier when we were watching and we first started to see the tear gas and the smoke that was being deployed, people who were down there and other people started talking about on Twitter that they believe this was all done so the president could make that walk from the White House over to the church there. Well, D.C. Council Chair Phil Mendelson is talking about it, and it seems that he agreed. He called the president's comments disgusting. He was talking about him using the military. This is him on Twitter. Unleashing the military on the city, protesters, and residents is unacceptable and unnecessary. And those are some of the same tweets that we saw from protesters down there who felt once they learned it was for that walk over, they were a little upset by all of that as well. Let's go back to Josh Rosenthal. He is live near where these right here where these arrests are happening right now. Josh, I'm just curious, what are the protesters saying?
So we've heard from some protesters, actually, if we could swing around here. This gentleman earlier was saying it's all worth it. It's all worth it. And I believe the reason is he's trying to make a point. Like we've talked about several times, we talked to that protester who said that she was taking a stand against oppression. And that's the kind of message that you hear from the people who are out here, from the people who are choosing to get arrested time after time after time. Now, you guys have been coming to me for probably about 30 minutes altogether now, just here at this scene. And you can see how that group of protesters over there, in between all of the police officers, it's really thinned out as police continue going in one by one, pulling protesters out, and then taking them over here to these police vans where they're being processed. And right now, I think just because there's so many people, a lot of them are waiting here. Hold on for a second. I'm sorry, sir. What was that?
I am being detained for peacefully protesting.
What this gentleman just told me is that he is being detained for peacefully protesting.
Never to the word. Never to the word. They surrounded us. They trapped us in a circle. Never said one word to us. We are here to express our voice, and they are suppressing our voice.
He said that he is here to express his voice, and they are suppressing his voice. Sir, I heard you say it was all worth it earlier. Why?
This is what it takes. This is what it takes for my
If this is what it takes for his children's future,
like a fucking human being, then I'm okay with this.
he said if this is what it takes to secure his children's future, then he's okay with this. He's having an issue here with police, but as you can see, a stark difference from what we were out here reporting for the past several nights. This is by far the most peaceful we have seen this downtown DC area in days. And yes, this protester isn't happy. However, he chose to get arrested. As you see him getting carried off, he made his point and he continues making it as he's getting carried away by police saying no justice, no peace. Guys, no justice, no peace, a refrain that we have heard consistently for days now.
In the case of that young man, as you checked in, I believe he had been held there for, I would say, a good 20, 30 minutes before we saw any action being made there. I'm curious if you had seen anybody, Josh, being detained but not necessarily taken away, or maybe freed at some points.
Do you need us to move?
I do. I asked you guys to stay back here.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
For the record, we're told to be on this side of that light pole, and I think we're okay right now. Jim, I apologize. I didn't hear all of what you said, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Just to get a sense, the young man that was just talking, I remember as you checked in with him that he had been there for a good 20 or 30 minutes, and I'm curious if you're seeing many people just detained and not necessarily transported anywhere.
It's very difficult to tell because there's so many people here. For sure, as you follow us down here, nobody's actually been transported because these three vans with the open backs have been here the entire time we've been here. However, I do believe that some people have been loaded into the back of the vans.
Hey, Josh, I want to read a tweet. This is the first tweet from Mayor Bowser since the curfew came out. I'm going to read this verbatim, a tweet from Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C. Quote, I imposed a curfew at 7 p.m. A full 25 minutes before the curfew and without provocation, federal police used munitions on peaceful protesters in front of the White House, an act that will make the job of D.C. police officers more difficult, shameful, D.C. residents, go home, be safe. That again from Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., as you continue to see what's unfolding right now. And yes, the curfew is in effect. Sean was mentioning a few moments ago about, I believe she mentioned Council Chair Phil Mendelson. Some other council members were angry, they say, about the president vowing to deploy the military in the city. There's something, as mentioned, it is called the Insurrection Act. It was last enacted in this country back in 1992 at the height of the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, that allows members of the military, active military, to take a law enforcement role on U.S. soil. That has not been invoked, regardless of what you may see on social media, with some people believing the president did that by virtue of a statement. He did not. That requires a presidential proclamation. President Trump has not done so yet.
Yeah, and Jim, I think what the mayor was referring to was the alleged use of some sort of tear gas or rubber bullets to disperse the crowd to allow him to make his walk from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church. And again, we see lawmakers across the board on Twitter, like Representative Val Demings, also saying that the president just had peaceful protesters gassed and shot with rubber bullets for a photo op. And I think that's what the mayor was referring to.
Yeah. And Marina, the Episcopal Bishop of D.C. is saying that very thing to the Washington Post tonight. Marianne Budge, the Reverend Marianne Budge, she's saying she is outraged that neither she nor the rector was asked or told they would be clearing with tear gas so they could use one of our churches as a prop.
Let's listen what's happening right here. We had many of the protesters taking a knee, laying down on the streets. We've been moving so much. Where are we on this shot right now? They're saying, whose streets? Our streets.
Is this the same camera? To me, yeah, it's hard to tell.
Okay, that is Fox News, but that is in Washington, D.C., correct? Okay. That is in Washington, D.C. That is one of our cameras. I'm trying to tell Blake, part of me wants to say this is 14th Street.
That's what it looks like to me. 14th
yeah, it is.
Street, looking towards Thomas.
That is actually the Popeye. I can see the Popeyes on the right side. That is definitely 14th Street, heading up towards up towards the U Street corridor.
Yep. So you're looking back down towards Thomas Circle as the crowd moves towards U Street, so north onto U Street on 14th.
That is a very large demonstration.
That is huge, Marina.
It is obviously they're taking over the entire corridor of 14th Street, which is a pretty large thoroughfare here in the district, and a main one at that. Again, no police presence, and we've been remarking that although we are almost 2 hours into this curfew, it seems like they are allowing this to happen despite being in this curfew and letting this protest continue as long as it continues peacefully.
And things have been peaceful, but I was down there today and everything was boarded up, just FYI.
I think one of the issues that, the police department, any police department is going to deal with are optics. You're not going to see a large group of people rushing in, trying to arrest people who are protesting peacefully. I think the issue comes when we start to see the other people who are the agitators and the people who come in to do things once nightfall happens. But I think the mayor had good intentions by issuing that curfew that was supposed to start tonight at 7 p.m., but the protesters had something else in mind. And yes, they're not supposed to be out there, but they're still protesting and they're still being peaceful. And again, if you look at that crowd, look at the diversity of this crowd. Do we have a reporter here? Who's with this scene, this particular scene? Evan Lambert, are you with this group?
That's Fox News.
Okay. Got it. I'm interested to know where they're walking to or if they're just walking through the city, because we've been hearing reports that as the crowd continues to walk, there are people that are hanging outside of their apartments to sort of cheer them on or, congratulate them or show their solidarity with this group of protesters.
This is 14th and P, for those of you just joining us, that they've just crossed P Street heading north on 14th towards you.
I think what's interesting too is the diversity of a message said in many different ways, but the unified sentiment we're seeing right now of where people stand and where these protests, the message these protesters want to get across, as we hear once again, no justice, no peace. Yeah, this is definitely in the covering ground very quickly too.
I'm trying here as we go through this to look at specific code that would speak to violation of curfew.
Yeah.
Because I believe it is a misdemeanor. It's minimal. I know that there's a juvenile curfew in the District of Columbia, and I believe the penalty is a $500 fine. But it looks like that for First Amendment peaceful assembly, I cannot find in the code what that fine would be, if any at all.
And Marina, as we talk about arrests, let's go back to Josh Rosenthal, who remains at I and 16th Street, where we have seen arrests of peaceful protesters. What's going on there now, Josh?
Yeah, 16th and I, and those arrests are ongoing. Take a look behind me. You can see all these people are still being processed now. We've shown you this a couple times, right? It's protesters who are peacefully sitting down, refusing to obey these curfew orders. Therefore, they're being picked up by police, brought over here, processed, and eventually put into these vans. Follow me over this way, though. This is where those protesters came from. This intersection, this is 16th and I. And earlier, this is where you saw all those military police, the DC National Guards members. They're actually still standing there. The officers on horseback have left. There are way fewer officers here. And I know it's difficult to see, but if you turn right, behind those trees there, that's the White House. So this is, very much the nation's capital here. We are 2 blocks from the White House. You have all these police officers standing around, and that big group of protesters that we first met up with here at 16th and I are now behind where you're looking, and they're being arrested while you see all these police here standing guard.
Yeah, Josh, and I can see they're taking a more relaxed position now. Aside from the protesters getting arrested, can you see any protesters remaining in that area?
No. And it's pretty incredible, especially given what the past few nights are. If you look, actually, let me change that. If you look beyond where this group of protesters is, Blake, there's actually another small group behind them, but I believe it's even smaller than the group of people that we're looking at now. And all of this is just in such stark contrast to what we've seen out here for the last 3 nights.
That other group that you're seeing, are they being arrested as well? Have they been surrounded, or are they just merely watching what's transpiring?
They were surrounded at a time. I do not know if there have actually been any arrests. It's a very good question. There are way fewer people there. From my vantage point, I can see some police officers at least not letting those people down this way, whether they are going to be arrested, whether they are sitting like the protesters that we see here. I just don't have a good enough vantage point to tell.
All right, Josh Rosenthal remaining on scene right there. Just to let all of you watching right now know what we will be doing here. We're going to continue our coverage starting at 9 o'clock on Fox 5 Plus. Blake and Marina will be standing by with more on that as well at 9 o'clock. We will continue coverage on fox5dc.com. But as you see another person being led away by police right now, we should point out, as we continue to see those protests on the left side of your screen, a large line of people marching down what was 14th Street earlier. I'm trying to tell if that is the same shot. Obviously, so many people on the move right now, taking to the streets, taking their message to the streets tonight. But as we see what's going on here in the city, over on Connecticut Street on the left side of your screen with police, or I'm sorry, Blake, what was that, 16th and I, where Josh was on the left side? Okay.
16th and I, yep.
Hey, Marina, give me a sense last night, since you were here and you were holding down the desk last night, what time, and I hate to, I think this has to be mentioned for context, what time would you say that we saw things escalate last night when it went from protest to chaos?
It was pretty early, Jim. I'd say it was about the same time. It was about 7 p.m. We are actually live on the air on Fox 5 Plus. We were taking Lindsay Watts' shot. She was just up I Street, about a block away from the White House, and we saw the crowd gather around a D.C. police cruiser, and all of a sudden 2 men jumped on top of that cruiser. They began to smash the hood, the windshield, and the crowd really turned. I mean, they were screaming, jeering. It seemed like they had cornered a few of the D.C. police officers who were on the scene there, and then from that point on, it continued, and once it got dark, like we're seeing now, about this time is when we started to see that things were flaring up, and once we were on the air at 10 o'clock, there were already fires. We saw that first brush fire on 8th Street, just a block away from the White House. Now, again, we saw the police lines far north from the White House, in essence, in protection, I imagine, of the White House, of the president, because he walked out to the church today. But you see here, I'm curious if once D.C. police is done securing this scene here on I and 16th, and they fill up those arrest vans with arrestees, if they will take those people to a police district, finish processing them, and if those CDU platoons that are on the scene will move on to another intersection and meet these protesters that we're seeing here on the lower right box. It's unclear, right? I mean, you see there is heavy police presence, and obviously you can't arrest everybody at the same time, but what happens next would be my question now as we approach 9 p.m.
Yeah, Marina, you've covered D.C. police. I mean, my guess is that they would be booked and released once police have a handle on the crowds.
Well, Blake, the District of Columbia is very interesting. The jail here in D.C. is under D.C. Police headquarters down on Indiana Avenue. It is not large by any stretch of the imagination. And when I talk about the jail, that's literally the processing jail. And then there is a D.C. jail, which is over on the northeast side. But that is where you hold people who are sentenced and convicted. And obviously, these folks who are being arrested tonight, if they're being arrested, they're in violation of curfew, which is a misdemeanor. So I think you're right. They will probably, they're processed now on the scene. They will probably be transported, I imagine, either to police headquarters or to the D.C. jail, whoever's better equipped to deal with mass arrests at this time, and then they will be released.
Yeah, let's not forget this is all happening in the middle of a pandemic. We have COVID-19. D.C. police have worked very hard over the last few months to clear the jails of as many people who don't need to be there, who aren't a threat to the community, and it's hard to make an argument that these people we see being arrested are an ongoing threat to the community once they're able to clear this area.
I want to talk for a brief second. Can we go? Let's take a look at that shot on the right if we can. And there's a reason why, because we were looking at 14th Street before, and I think, Sean, what amazes me is the symbolism of, you think back, obviously none of us were here in 1968, but the symbolism of that being such a flashpoint in this city's racial tension, in this city's racial fabric, where we had the riots that were centered on 14th Street.
The 1968 riots came shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And there were so many businesses that were destroyed along that corridor. I can remember, because I've talked to her several times about this, Ben's Chili Bowl was one of the places that was not touched back then. And in fact, they used to organize the protest and some of the rallies that were happening there. But yeah, I mean, it's a stark contrast, because we're seeing an incredibly large group of people marching down 14th Street. They are peaceful right now. During those 68 riots in D.C., I believe there were more than 1,100 buildings that were destroyed, 1,200 fires. They brought in federal troops to sort of to quell the violence and what was happening during the city at that point. But people were upset that Martin Luther King, a black man, was assassinated, and here we have another group of rioters, or excuse me, another group of protesters, excuse me, not rioters, a group of protesters who are out there, and they are protesting the death of a black man. It is incredible to see that. It is incredible to see how long ago that was, and the generation of young people who are out here marching right now, the generation of black people, the generation of white people, just the diversity in this crowd who are all marching together for that same reason. They're tired of the injustice, the unrest back during the civil rights rallies. Martin Luther King's death certainly was one of the culminations of one of those events that sparked all kinds of rallies and protests. And here we're watching something similar again. People are fed up and people are tired, and they don't know what else to do to have their voices heard. While Martin Luther King Jr. always talked about peace, we know that one of the speeches or one of the interviews that he gave in 1968 was him essentially saying that the language or people riot because their voices are not being heard. We're seeing peaceful protests today of people who want their voices to be heard. And hopefully whoever's watching and is listening is hearing those voices.
I think that's important to point out, Sean, because, again, it's easy to have the message drowned out in everything that we saw over the last 24, 48 hours in this city. There is still a cohesive message. I'm actually surprised to see people still out on the streets right now at this hour.
It looks like they've turned onto U Street. Speaking of Ben's Chili Bowl, they're
right, absolutely,
They're about to pass Ben's Chili Bowl here on the left as they head east now on U Street.
There it is, Blake. Good call. Yep, they're definitely on U Street at this hour. And listen to the horns. Listen to the chants.
Sean, we only have about a minute left of our coverage here on Fox 5 before we switch over to Channel 20, WDCA, Fox 5 Plus. I'm just curious if you have any closing thoughts of what we've seen tonight and how different it was from what we saw over the weekend.
I think it's just remarkable. We're continuing to see peaceful protest. I pray that this continues into the night. So as Jim said, it doesn't overshadow what the real message is here. You can see it right there. George Floyd, say his name. Something needs to change, and that's why those people are out there marching and trying to raise their voices to let America know.
So in the meantime, Sean and I are going to leave the desk. We're going to prepare for the news at 10. We'll be back on Fox 5 right here in a few minutes. Blake and Marina are going to continue our coverage on Fox 5 Plus, WDCA Channel 20, or on fox5dc.com.